PEX A is one of the easiest and fastest ways to plumb in a shower valve. I'm going to show you how to do it from start to finish. We'll go over all the different tools and materials that you're going to need, and in the end, I think you'll be astonished at how quick this can be. The first step in this particular project is to drill these holes a little bit bigger because I'm going to be using acoustic through-stud isolators. This is what they look like, and I'm going to be using an 1.25 inch drill bit for this. I simply drill through both the bottom plate and the plywood, and the most important thing is that I make square cuts with my PEX A. That cutter is awesome for it, and then I fish this down through the hole and simply clamp the through-stud isolator onto the PEX A and then tap it down into the hole that I drilled. It's really important that these be nice and tight because they're going to clamp the pipe and then I screw it to the bottom plate. But by clamping the pipe, it prevents that squeaking and that expansion that you hear with copper pipes that creates a lot of creaking inside the walls. This is also good for the PEX A as well, and I simply screw the isolators down into that bottom plate. Wood blocking is one of the most important steps for any shower valve, and I had to cut this down to the right depth. So we actually ran that through a table saw, and then I'm going to pre-drill it and make sure that this goes completely through this tiny piece of wood. This is actually about 1 inch thick because we had to account for the OSB that's in the wall that somebody else did for that drywall repair. In this instance, I'm going to be using 3 1/8 inch screws and drilling those down at an angle. I'm toe screwing these into the studs on the left and the right at the top and the bottom. Now obviously I could also go through the stud on the right in the two different places, but the depth is important for these delta valves, and typically you'll be able to use that mud ring to help you set the depth. I then set the valve inside the wall using galvanized screws, and this is really important. There's a little bracket on the back of it. Sometimes the screws get loose. You can see them right there. So just make sure you tighten those before you move on. In the shower, I'm going to be using PEX A, and so the PEX A fittings are specific to the tubing. In this case, I'm going to be aligning the horizontal tube with the vertical tube, and I simply cut this to size. As I said earlier, the most important thing is to make square cuts because if the pipe or the tube isn't square, you're going to have issues. For this, I'm going to be using these expansion sleeves. These are 1/2 inch expansion sleeves that have stops on them, and I push them down as far as they'll go on top of the PEX A. And then I expand it about 5 to 6 times. This is 1/2 inch PEX A, and I'm using an M18 tool for this. The nice thing for that is it auto rotates as well. And then I slide that into the left-hand port, and then I align the vertical tubing with that and make a square cut. You can see that the top of the vertical tubing is right at the bottom of the horizontal. This is what makes it really easy. Then I slide on the sleeve to the stop, do the same thing for the horizontal red piece, and then I expand that again 5 to 6 times. Now the color coding is interesting. It really doesn't impart any difference in the tubing. It just kind of indicates that you're going to have hot on the left, cold on the right. And then what I do after I expand it, I put in that 90-degree elbow, and then I do the exact same thing for the horizontal piece. Typically, I don't want the horizontal piece to be less than 3 inches. You definitely do not want the fitting to touch another fitting, for example, the fitting inside the valve. I make my square cuts for the cold piece. This one's a little bit too long, so I simply just cut off a little bit more, about a 1/2 inch, and that way I have some room inside the cavity. The sleeves are really essential for this. You absolutely need the sleeves for PEX A. By the way, the tubing and the sleeves, they're all made by SharkBite, and I bought these at Lowe's. So you can get all these supplies at your local store. So in our case, I'm in Pittsburgh, and I just get all my SharkBite supplies for this at the Lowe's that's local to me. Once again, I add the sleeve to the right side of that after I slide on the PEX A tubing onto the right side of the valve. Again, the blue tubing is an indicator that this is the cold water supply line. I slide on that 90-degree elbow. You don't necessarily need the elbows if you can bend the tubing. I'll go into that a little bit more later on. But in this case, I didn't have enough room room to bend the PEX A without kinking it. PEX A is more flexible than PEX B, and that's another reason why I like using it inside tight spots like this. So once I have all my PEX A in place, I screw the valve back to the 2x material that's inside the wall, and I make it nice and solid. This is a diverter valve, and I need to cap the right hand side because that's what the directions say to do. So I apply about 3 to 4 revolutions of tape to that. This is a special tape that I like using. It's called Megatape, and then I apply Blue Monster pipe thread sealant over top of this. The reason why I like using both is this really reduces the odds of having a water leak. And the reason why I have to do this is because not only do I have to cap this right hand side, I actually have to add 3 fittings to this diverter valve because I'm using PEX A. Unfortunately, these diverter valves don't come with PEX A fittings. So I tighten this by hand, and then I use my wrench to tighten it even further. In this case, I'm going to be using the SharkBite PEX A 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch female adapter. Once again, I use 3 to 4 revolutions of the Megatape followed by the pipe thread sealant. I don't know if you noticed this or not, but the main valve actually had PEX A fittings soldered onto it at the factory. So I didn't have to do this for the main shower valve, which was pretty awesome. And by the way, those valves are not very expensive. They're typically between $55 and $75. But in this case, I tighten the PEX A adapters and put them in place. Now, the depth of this is also critical. So in this instance, I'm using a 2x4, and I'm going to toe screw this in place on the left-hand side at the top and at the bottom. One thing I do want to mention is I want to make sure that this valve is plumb, that the 2x4 is plumb in there. Now, I like marking the location of the holes for the bracket on there, and that allows me to line up the center point of the valve with my laser and also align it with the top and the bottom ports of the main shower valve. You can see it's straight up and down. It's nice and plumb because my 2x4 is plumb, and it's also set at the right depth. What is that depth? Well, per the directions, the backer board and the tile should come out about 1/8 of an inch beyond that bonnet nut. And that's exactly what I've got here. So don't forget to correctly set the depth of the diverter valve as well. The handheld shower wand in this shower is going to go to the left, and I need to cut a hole into this stud. So again, I'm going to be using about 1 inch hole saw for that, and it's directly across from the left-hand port of this diverter valve. Now, the cool thing with PEX A, remember what I said, is it's very flexible. So I'm going to be able to run one continual piece down to that spot there. Here's the other important thing to remember, the location of this drop here. Normally, I want this to be at least 5 inches away from the left edge of that stud. And the reason why is when you install the actual trim, you want to be able to do that, and you won't be able to if you don't have the right dimension. So again, I'm applying my sleeve to the PEX A. This is white PEX A, and I like using white just to indicate that it's a mix of cold and hot. I add that to the diverter valve, and then I thread it to my hole, and I'm just using one piece. You can see how easy the PEX A is to bend. I make my square cut, and now I'm going to use a PEX A drop here for this. Again, these are all SharkBite fittings. I like using brass, by the way, and you can only get brass in the drop ears where I'm located. So I do my 5 to 6 expansions with the sleeve and the tubing, add my drop ear, hold that in place for about 30 seconds, and it's done. But the other big tip is to use all 3 screw holes to secure this or fasten it to the 2x4. Once I'm done with that step, the last step, I need to make my connection between the diverter valve and the main valve. So once again, I cut my tubing to the size that I need, and I add my sleeves to the top and the bottom. Now in this case, I like to loosen the diverter valve, and that way it helps me make these connections. I do my 5 to 6 expansions, and then I place that on the diverter valve. It's just easier this way. Well, actually, I take that back. It's on the main valve, and then I do the diverter valve. But it doesn't really matter which one you do as long as you do the right expansions and you push these sleeves up to the shoulder of the fitting. The shoulder of the fitting is the maximum location where you want that sleeve to end. You can see that my diverter valve is in line with the main valve, and that's a good thing. The next step is to do the riser pipe. So in this case, I'm going to use another drop ear specifically for PEX A. Again, it's got 3 screw holes. I add my sleeve to the PEX A, do my expansions, and then I place the drop ear into that. I try to hold these fittings in place for a solid 15 to 30 seconds. You'll find that after that 30-second mark, it's not going to be very easy to move the fitting up against that sleeve. So I like doing the drop ear first, and then what I do is the top fitting of the diverter valve. And the reason why is it just is easier, in my opinion, to do that. I place this on the diverter valve, hold it in place, and then what I can do is screw the drop ear to that 2x4. Again, you want to use all 3 screw holes. And then I secure or fasten the diverter valve to the 2x4. If I have any loose PEX inside the wall, I use a clamp and attach that to the studs. But you can see this was really fast and easy. This whole thing probably only took me about an hour, and that's because I'm making a video for it. But the most important thing to me is that that diverter valve and the main valve align with the drop ear, and then that this is one continual piece, and that's 5 inches from the stud. Now, don't forget your Boca plate. I'm going to use a 5 by 8 inch steel plate here with some screws. This is going to protect the PEX from being penetrated when I add my curdy board to the wall. Now here's one thing that I wanted to mention. After I'm done setting the valve, I take off the plaster guard. As a matter of fact, you probably didn't even see it on throughout the entire project. And that's because I set the valve to the right depth and then I just quickly removed it. And when I did that, I knew that when I was going to set my backer board, in this case curdy board, on the wall, that was going to be set such that the tile on top of it would be at the correct depth that Delta wanted for the valve. So you always want to try to set your shower valve to the correct depth based off of the directions. I did the exact same thing for the diverter valve, and then I put brass nipples in place for the shower head and the shower wand. Now in this case, I did waterproof around the valves and the nipple for the handheld shower wand. That's just something that I like to do. And then obviously everything is waterproof around that. So I wanted to address the fact that I don't keep that plaster guard in place once I get the backer board on the wall. I love using PEX A, in this case SharkBite PEX A, along with the SharkBite fittings because this project is fast, it's simple, it's clean, and it's leak-free. I also make sure my valves are aligned with each other and that the drop ears have all 3 screw holes fastened. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to help.